Can we look forward to an Earth apocalypse? Futurology, eco-theology, and eco-ethics. Climate change, ecology, theology, ethics. I don't know about you, but I am grateful to those religious leaders around the world who have found the courage to stand up publicly and defend the sustainability of our planet, the ability of our fecund planet to support life. Hello, I'm Ted Peters, and the ride we're about to take begins in the 1960s and runs right down to the present time. I'd like to show that the seeds were planted in the garden of futurist visions, seeds that grew and blossomed until we have the creative, ambitious, and energetic ecological theologies and ecological ethical zeal that we see today. It's going to be an exciting ride. Revelation chapter 6. I heard one of the four living creatures call out, as with a voice of thunder, hum. I looked, and there was a white horse. Its rider had a bow. A crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. When he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature call out, come! And out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth so that people would slaughter one another, and he was given a great sword. When he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature call out, come! I looked, and there was a black horse. Its rider held a pair of scales in his hand, and I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, a quart of wheat for a day's pay, 3 quarts of barley for a day's pay, but do not damage the olive oil and the wine. When he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature call out, come! I looked, and there was a pale horse. Its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed with him. They were given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword, famine, and pestilence, and by the wild animals of the earth. This ride that you and I are now taking has a destination, namely the construction of an eco-theology accompanied by an eco-ethic, both of which are forms of public theology. Now, I define public theology as theology that is conceived in the church, critically reflected upon in the academy, and then meshed with the world the theologian wants to serve. Public theology serves the world more than it serves the church. This world that you and I are living in here in the early decades of the 21st century is sitting on top the backs of the four horses of the apocalypse. We're headed towards eco disaster. What the public theologian wants to do is to steer those four horses toward a preferred future, a future of a just, sustainable, participatory, and planetary society. I'm glad you're coming along for the ride. Today is already yesterday's future. Meet Richard Norgaard. Richard and his colleagues are working diligently to preserve the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. Richard and I team taught the eco crisis, climate change, theology, economics, and ethics over at the University of California for a few years. Here's what he writes in an article he's getting ready to publish with his colleagues. As the effects of climate change gain force, the environment is changing more rapidly. Extreme events, droughts, heat waves, forest fires, and floods are becoming more frequent and more extreme. Ecosystems are being driven to or beyond thresholds of irreversible change. That's what's happening right now. Unfortunately, this was forecasted almost 60 years ago. Those forecasters I call prophets, and just like the prophets of ancient Israel, nobody listened. The first whisperings of futuristic thinking were heard already in the 1950s. And the proposition that it is a positive vision of the future that will pull together a society so that all will work together towards making this world a better place. By 1967, consciousness of the deterioration of our planet and the observation that we, the human race, are responsible for that deterioration was plaguing the minds of our futurists, our future-oriented thinkers. Here we are in 1967. The journal is Science, one of the two most important journals read by scientists all over the world. Lynn White writes an article on the historical roots of our ecological crisis, and he blames the Bible. Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 29, the human race is given dominion over the natural world, and that's the problem, says Dr. White. The people of the book, the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims, but especially the Christians, are guilty of thinking of themselves as living in the image of God, having dominion over the earth, and treating the earth as a ruthless king, a tyrant would treat his subjects. The bulldozer mentality, we just roll over the earth, changing it willy-nilly to meet our own selfish species needs. Well, that's what Dr. White said in Science magazine. The world is facing an ecological crisis, and we're going to blame the Christians. We're going to blame the Bible. Well, what Mr. White wanted to do, of course, was to wake us up from our slumber and realize that we've got a responsibility ahead. And instead of thinking of ourselves as having dominion over nature, we should somehow or other share with nature in its creative and fecund and nourishing ways of doing things. 1967. Lynn White sparked a firestorm on how to interpret the book of Genesis. Scholars started opening up their Bibles and looking again at chapter 1, verses 26 through 29, and discovered that that word for dominion, the Hebrew word is radah. And when we look at the enthronement psalms, we find that the king is given radah. That means the king must rule with justice. Express compassion to the widow and the orphan to make sure that they get their security check. So, by analogy, when the human race in Genesis chapter 1 is given dominion over the earth, the human race should rule with radah, justice, and compassion. Take a look at what Havatros Samuelson at Arizona State University says as she responds to Lynn White. The Jewish sacred text espouses deep concern for the well-being of the earth and all its inhabitants because it asserts that the earth belongs to God, Psalm 24, and humans are but temporary caretakers or stewards of God's earth. Well, Dr. Teros Samuelson proceeds to develop an eco-Judaism. She extrapolates on the notion of kosher. Eco-kosher means that Jews should only consume products that meet both Jewish dietary laws as well as Jewish ethical standards. And eco-kosher consumers should encourage food producers to care for the environment, animals, and their workers. So here in the 21st century, we have an eco-theology blossoming, but the seed was sown in 1967. Our planet is round. From space, you can't see the borders that divide the nations into separate political units. The weather doesn't give a hoot about which country it's dropping rain or refusing to drop rain during a drought. In 1986, the radioactive cloud from Chernobyl traveled across Siberia and across the Pacific, dropped radioactivity in Alaska and California. Why can't we think about the entire planet Earth as a single residence for us all, humans and animals, plants, and everything else that makes the ecosystem of the one planet what it is? Well, this holistic planetary vision became a public symbol by 1970 with the first Earth Day. Do you celebrate Earth Day every year on April 22nd? The World Future Society was founded in 1967, and it brought together professional people in government and business, in science, especially social science. Yes, there were just a few theologians who dribbled in. The futurists look forward to the future. They didn't make predictions, they made forecasts of what might or might not happen. The word for future that I elect to use to describe the futurists is futurum, the Latin word for future, which means a future that builds upon past trends and present decisions that form then what will happen in the future. I like the way the futurist stands in the present moment, looking out towards tomorrow. with three categories. The first is possible futures, what might happen, and the advent of the computer age now makes it a lot easier to adumbrate the possible futures. The second category are probable futures, that is to say, we evaluate the possible futures according to what is more likely and what is less likely. Finally, the preferred future. We need a vision of what is good, what we desire, especially what is good for the planet and the common good, and then enlist willpower, the decision making, the choice, the commitment to bring to pass that which will be good. So the human will, the human ability to choose better or worse, becomes a very factor in forecasting the future. There is a second way to understand the future. It's a theological word, Adventus. For those of you who are members of liturgical churches, you know how you have the season of Advent, which precedes Christmas. The future understood as Adventus is unpredictable because it is God's future, and God can act in ways that do not require precedence. God can do surprising things. So that's what we see here in this cartoon. Well, we've got God watching the weather report and laughing and laughing. How often do weather reporters get it right or get it wrong? Is that the intersection of Adventus with Futurum? The Club of Rome, an international organization of business people and scientists, put together their world famous study called The Limits to Growth in 1972, in which they used the computer to project, on the basis of past and present trends, what might happen. What are the possible futures when it comes to population growth, agricultural production, industrial production, pollution production, and such. And their projections comparing possible and probable futures all suggested that somewhere in this century we're going to have a massive dieback. That is to say, modern civilization cannot continue on this path indefinitely without making decisions that will lead to a preferred future over the ones that the Club of Rome had forecasted. In 1960, there were 3 billion people living on this planet. Today, there are 7 billion. How many people can our planet support? Can we continue indefinitely to expand our industrial base globe-wide, or is there a limit? In 1972, the Club of Rome was very concerned about starvation. Will the agricultural machine continue to produce enough food to feed the increased population? In 1973 and 1974, mass starvation broke out in the Sahel region of Africa, and that was followed a few years later by an enormous plague, the HIV AIDS plague, which was all over, still not over. 40 million people died. Well, on the food matter, we have achieved greater efficiency in food production in recent years, which means we can support a much larger population than the Club of Rome had originally forecasted. But is it infinite? The burning of the jungles in Brazil, the lungs of the planet, has been in the news recently, but it's actually been going on for decades. The Earth's ability to produce oxygen for us to breathe is diminishing. The Club of Rome was concerned in 1972 about the depletion of non renewable natural resources. Every natural resource, such as gold, has got a finite limit, right? At some point, we'll dig it all up and spend it all. In particular, carbon based energy, petroleum, natural gas, and such must have a finite limit. The Club of Rome had forecasted that somewhere near the present time we would be approaching that limit. As it turns out, more petroleum reserves have been found than were earlier forecasted. Be that as it may, there will be a finite limit that will hit sooner or later. The optimists and the pessimists in the 1970s looked to the time when petroleum reserves would be diminishing and we could forecast the end of oil. And optimists said, well, the price will go up as the supply diminishes. And when the price goes up, then alternative forms of energy will become relatively cheaper, and the planet will make a nice, peaceful transition to wind power, solar power, and all of the alternatives. Well, what was not anticipated was the human factor. Those profiting from carbon-based fuels are finding all kinds of ways to gerrymander the economy to retard the development of alternative forms of energy, to sustain the burning of carbon fuels just long enough so that we can so pollute the atmosphere that the temperature of the planet will rise, and so will the sea levels. Are we really happy we found those extra petroleum reserves? When I was a kid growing up, I liked Mad Magazine. The cover of this issue dates to 1950. I lived in Durban, Michigan, just a little west of Detroit. The Rouge River flowed through my neighborhood. It was polluted because of the Ford Motor Company. I grew up thinking that all rivers were similarly polluted. I didn't get to see a fresh mountain stream with living trout until I was around for a quarter of a century. Let me tell you a story. It's based upon circumstantial evidence, but could be true. Goes like this. 1972, the Club of Rome publishes The Limits to Growth in 30 languages. Among those who read it are the Arabs. And they realize, or at least think, that the oil supply, the reserves of petroleum, are going to be running out in the foreseeable future. The cash cow is going to get thinner and thinner until she passes away. It's our time to make a profit before it all goes bust. So they created OPEC. And with this monopoly, they suddenly jacked up the prices of petroleum. The price of gasoline for Americans went through the roof. And suddenly, money from Western Europe, America, and East Asia just flowed like Niagara Falls into the coffers of the OPEC nations. Well, Houston got a little jealous of all that money going over there, and so the next few years, Houston began making deals with those Arab countries, and the Arabs threatened again in 1979 with a second Arab oil embargo. But by the time we got to 1980, and a Texas oil man in the White House by the name of Bush as vice president, those deals were made, and all the Arab profits were now divided with Houston, Texas, and Houston between 1980 and 1985. Just really leaped in per capita value. So when the prophets announce that we have a tragedy coming in the future, some of us want to turn the prophet, P-H-E-T, into profit, P-R-O-F-I-T, and I think they certainly were successful when it comes to the non-renewable natural resource we know of as petroleum. Already 50 years ago, the secular prophets were forecasting global warming. They understood the principles for which we now have the data that show how the burning of fossil fuels leads to the greenhouse effect. The planet retains heat, the icebergs melt, the water levels rise, and the weather gets more unpredictable and more violent. Those who are pressing the nations of the world to make the decisions to reduce greenhouse gas production, to move from petroleum to alternative forms of energy, want to save the planet before it advances to 2 degrees centigrade higher than it was before the industrial era. Who's going to win in this race? How do we measure the speed at which our planet is warming up? Well, we have to go up higher on the mountain each winter to ski. Is that a good measure? The scientists tell us that the waters of the oceans absorb the heat before the air does. So by the time we take off our sweater because the temperature is going up, the fish have already experienced the heating up of their environment. Beginning in 1987, we started setting new records for the hottest years on the planet since records have been kept. 2017 was one of those record setting years, and somebody's translated the indirect costs of global warming on expenditures, $320 billion of indirect costs due to global warming, $265 billion for hurricanes alone. Has the wrath begun? You've heard me refer to the World Future Society, the Club of Rome, and other futurists of 5 or so decades ago as prophets, P-H-E-T-S, those who look to the future and then demand of those of us in the present that we make the right decisions in order to ward off impending judgment. Well, the prophets of ancient Israel, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, what have you, they ran into a problem. Quite frequently, they would confront their constituencies with the Word of God, but not everybody listened. Listen, says the prophet Isaiah, you that are deaf, and you that are blind, look up and see. It's clear that over the last 5 decades, the planet has not listened. And now the wrath that was forecasted is on the way. I made my own attempts at prophesying. Here's one of my early books, Futures, Human and Divine. If you turn it upside down, you'll see that it's industry puffing smoke into the atmosphere. This was followed by Fear, Faith, and the Future in 1980. One of the projects I worked on for the Department of Energy was high-level nuclear waste siting. Did a little work on that. President Jimmy Carter had decided in his term, 1976 to 1980, that the siting of all nuclear waste would have been accomplished by 1997. When the Reagan administration took over in 1980, all those plans were scrapped. And so you still see highly radioactive effluent sitting on sites at our nuclear reactors, just plain sitting there, waiting for spillage or sabotage. The Reagan administration from 1980 to 88 was known for its discounting of the future. At least one person read Futures, Human and Divine. Jay Gary told me that this book inspired him to proceed to develop a number of foresight projects. He's currently the chair of the Association of Professional Futurists, and he works to integrate secular futurology with Christian eschatology. A few minutes ago, I identified a distinguishing characteristic of futuristic thinking: the threefold approach of identifying possible futures, probable futures, and preferred futures. All of that is set within a scientific and technological framework, which I call the UDC formula, understanding, decision, and control. If we can understand the trends, and if we can anticipate surprises, then we can make the decisions that we need to that will actualize the future. That means we can control the future. There's that sense of control built right into the futurum dimension of futurology or futurism. The futurists were smart enough to know that there could be surprises. There could be elements of Adventus in the future, to be sure. But control, wouldn't it be wonderful if the human race could control its own destiny? Well, it seems that over the last 5 decades, the human race has decided not to control its own destiny. Now, the theologian's going to ask, why? Lack of foresight or sin? It was not only the doomsday prophets riding the horses of the apocalypse, there were also religious leaders and some theologians on a horse riding at the same speed as the computerized technologists who were forecasting the future. That leadership came primarily from the World Council of Churches in 1967, which began its Anticipation Project. In 1979, the WCC convened an international conference at MIT that included both the scientists and the theologians to deal with the future of our planet, and lifted up a banner, a flag they waved. We look forward to a just, sustainable, and participatory planetary society. Just, sustainable, and participatory were the words of the WCC. I add planetary because it's inconceivable that the health of the planet is going to return when we have competing nations and a win-lose mindset. We have to advance to a planetary mindset before we can think about a just, sustainable, and participatory society. Among the theologians who were willing to take this on as an agenda already, Jürgen Moltmann at Tübingen, John Cobb at Claremont, Larry Rasmussen at Union Seminary, John Weaver, not remembered, he was a pastor at Grace Cathedral in San Francisco. But, like the other prophets, these few theologians hollered down an alley, and nobody was willing to listen to them. Not the churches, let alone anyone outside the churches, but they did speak. Listen to or not, they did speak. One of the reasons that the prophetic and future-oriented theologians could not be heard in the churches, let alone the seminaries and the universities, was they were drowned out by louder voices. The loud voices of the 1970s were liberation theology and feminist theology. These two schools of thought believed that the advance of science only buttressed and supported the colonial, the patriarchal, the economic divisions that lead to oppression around the world. We cannot fraternize with those scientists. And you have to do that if you're going to deal with the world problematique, if you're going to deal with the challenge to the health of the planet. It will have to be in partnership with science. Here's Rubem Alves objecting to the WCC in 1979. Is it not exactly from science that the possibility of annihilation came? Or do the A-bomb and intercontinental rockets not belong to the essence of science? Those of us trying to lead the churches to liberate the oppressed, how can we do that if we're linking arms with the scientists? Similarly, leading feminist scholar Rosemary Radford Ruther issued a battle call against patriarchy in secular society and in religious structures. Part of the problem with that colonial mindset, patriarchal mindset, is its relationship to science. If we're going to liberate, we cannot do so linked arm in arm with science. In 1979, Rosemary said in both the dominant religious consciousness and the dominant scientific consciousness, with few exceptions, women have been situated on the underside of history. Both religion and science have located women in the realm of matter, of body, of earth, matter over against spirit, body over against mind, earth over against heaven. In this kind of situation where our intense concern should be the liberation of women from patriarchy, we don't really have time or energy to give to rescuing the planet, especially if our partner rescuers are scientists. The liberation theologians and feminist theologians began changing their mind after a 1986 disaster. It was the nuclear meltdown at the Chernobyl energy plant in the Soviet Union. And when that radioactive cloud climbed into the sky and slowly made its way across Siberia, across the Pacific, across North America, across the Atlantic, across Europe, it became clear to the world that we are all interconnected, and that means the oppressed and the oppressors belong to a single world. If we're going to think about a wholesome future, we're in this together. And towards the end of the last century, the agenda of the Liberation School and Feminist School and related emancipatory theological schools of thought began to see the indelible relationship between social justice on the one hand and planetary health on the other. When I first arrived in Berkeley in 1978 to take up my teaching position at the Graduate Theological Union, one of the first things I did was look around for other scholars who might be riding horses in the apocalypse. I found a few at PSR, the Pacific School of Religion. We worked together on producing this book, The Cry of the Environment, in 1982. I don't think anybody read it. Kind of like those earlier prophets, we were shouting down an alley and could hear only our own echo. When that group, that project, broke up, nothing happened at the GTU for almost 2 more decades. Bob Russell at the Center for Theology and Natural Sciences did oversee a few dissertations on environment. Carol Robb at the Presbyterian School did also have a number of students. Students were interested, even if the faculty seemed to be oh hum about it. At the University of California at Berkeley, right across the street, Carolyn Merchant had published her breathtakingly insightful book on the death of nature and was drawing students. And Richard Norgaard in Energy and Resources had worked right down until just recently on issues of climate change. And Richard and I actually team taught and shared supervision of some graduate students. The situation over the last decade or so has been much better. And we're now kind of faculty rich with Cynthia Moe-Lobeda and Rita Sherma guiding a number of students who are working on scholarly issues related to eco-theology and eco-ethics. The first prophets announcing the coming of a natural apocalypse were the scientists. They were joined quickly thereafter by people in business and government. So our forebears in religious leadership and theologians had to take their cues initially from science. Take a look at 1992. A joint appeal by religion and science for the environment, a declaration of the mission to Washington, scientists and theologians together, asking a recalcitrant White House and Congress to get on board. The health of the planet is an urgent matter. We've had 12 years of Reagan and Bush, which scrapped the future-oriented plans of predecessor President Jimmy Carter. We believe that science and religion working together have an essential contribution to make toward any significant mitigation and resolution of the world, not American, the world environmental crisis. Look at some of those in attendance. Ian Barber, founder and dean, so to speak, of the field of theology and science. Herbert Chilstrom, then president of the Lutheran Church in America. Richard Norgaard, whom I mentioned earlier, in energy and resources at the University of California, Berkeley. Robert John Russell, founder of the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences at Berkeley. Carl Sagan, the famed physicist at Cornell. Edward O. Wilson, the father of American sociobiology at Harvard. Now look at the green print down there. This is something that should make happy both the World Council of Churches as well as liberation and feminist theologians. We reaffirm here in the strongest possible terms the indivisibility of social justice and the preservation of the environment. For the next few slides, I'd like to just lift up some of our leading eco-theologians and eco-ethicists, those who are contemporary to us. Here's Sally McFague. Sally McFague belongs in that tradition of panentheism, where Alfred North Whitehead, among others, had described the world as God's body, one way of emphasizing how everything is connected to everything else. Dr. McFague says the world as God's body is appropriate for our time. It focuses attention on the near, on the neighbor, on the earth, on meeting God not later in heaven, but here and now. We meet God in the world, and especially in the flesh of the world, in feeding the hungry, healing the sick, and in reducing greenhouse gases. Here's a person I have not yet met, but look forward to, Melanie Harris, who takes that step beyond feminist theology to womanist theology and then to eco-womanism. Eco-womanism is critical reflection, contemplation, and praxis-oriented study of environmental justice, environment plus justice, from the perspectives of women of color and particularly women of African descent. It links a social justice agenda with eco-justice. As I mentioned earlier, after 1986, it became much easier to enlist liberation theologians and feminist theologians in the task of developing an ecological public theology. In Berkeley, Carolyn Merchant had already in the 1970s become a spokesperson for a secular, naturalistic approach to preserving the health and fecundity of our planet. Later, Rosemary Radford Ruther came to Berkeley to teach at the Graduate Theological Union, and then arrived Whitney Bauman, then a graduate student, but Whitney was filled with zeal to turn Berkeley green, both the university and the GTU green, and that would only be a step to turning the whole planet green. Well, we at the Center for Theology and Natural Sciences had a little funding at the time. We gave it to Whitney, and he went to work. He brought Carolyn Merchant and Rosemary Ruther together. They team taught a course. They had a number of public events, figuratively speaking, painting our city of Berkeley green. Well, Whitney went and graduated, got his PhD, and ran off to Florida International University, and I'm expecting the future maps to show green just spreading from Florida all over the globe. In the post-Chernobyl period, Sharon Delgado came to the Pacific School of Religion, a Methodist pastor and today quite a climate change activist. Sharon wanted to paint the United Methodist Church green and all of North America right along with it. Her key insight was to adapt the Wesleyan quadrilateral, that is to say, scripture, tradition, reason, and experience, to developing an eco-theology and an eco-ethic. This is Nancy Weems, Presbyterian pastor, wrote her doctoral dissertation on eco-theology and eco-ethics under Bob Russell. Currently in Marin as an eco-activist. She heads an organization called Emergence Initiatives, and Nancy wants to cultivate in us good food and fasting habits so that what we eat and don't eat make us constantly aware, spiritually aware of our relationship to the health of the entire planet. Chris Doran, currently a professor at Pepperdine University. He wrote his PhD dissertation here under the CTNS faculty at the GTU, has this new and exciting book, Hope in the Age of Climate Change. One of Chris's contributions to a constructive ecological public theology is the concept of ecocyn. Ecocyn may be defined as the rejection of creation as a gift from God. A gift from God. I think of Cynthia Moe-Lobeda as a special person. I'm proud to have served with her on the faculty at Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary for a number of years. She serves also in the doctoral studies program here at the GTU. Cynthia did her own graduate studies under Larry Rasmussen at Union Seminary in New York. Larry, as I mentioned before, was one of the first generation pioneers in developing an ecological public theology. One of Cynthia's major contributions to eco-theology and eco-ethics is her analysis of structural evil. Remember, Chris Doran had described eco-sin as forgetting that the creation is a gift from God. Cynthia's distinctive contribution is to show how institutional evil, especially economic and political evil, put up barriers from conscientious ecologists who really want to take the actions that will make our planet a healthier place. The moral crisis screams, says Dr. Moe-Lobeda. Homo sapiens are using and degrading the planet's natural goods at a rate that Earth's ecosystems cannot sustain. We have generated an unsustainable relationship with our planetary home. What are the forces that resist ecological consciousness and eco-ethical responsibility, economic and political? What if a leader of a great nation responsible for agricultural production, industrial production, pollution production, simply refuses to believe what the scientific prophets are saying? What if a political leader says the whole idea of climate change or global warming is a hoax? And it's not a hoax that he is perpetrated. He's going to blame it on the Chinese. Well, this kind of thinking at the national or international level makes for a really bad day for an eco-theologian or an eco-ethicist. I told you to listen to the climate science. Thank you, New Yorker Magazine. Another fine resource here at the Graduate Theological Union is Professor Rita Sharma. I've really come to appreciate her skill in drawing resources from the rich tradition of Hinduism in India and pressing them into the service of an ecological theology and an ecological ethic. Conceptual resources for ecology and Hindu thought and practice abound, she says, in worship. Rita drinks deeply from the preciousness of the land, waterways, mountains, forests, and other living creatures. Rita Sharma finds the waterways precious. I think this gives voice to Dr. Sharma's sense of attunement between her spirit and the natural world. Chris Doran, similarly, wants us to cultivate a sense of the giftedness of the planet on which we live. I would like to speculate a little bit just how might we draw upon the rich Hindu heritage in constructing a contemporary eco-theology or eco-ethic. I think of the two paradigmatic philosophical thinkers, Shankara and Ramanuja. Shankara, the father, so to speak, of non-dualism or Advaita Vedanta, he contended, over against Ramanuja, he contended that ultimate reality, Brahman, should be understood impersonally as Nirguna Brahman, that is to say, the unity of all things beyond attributes. Ramanuja, coming a couple centuries later, said, no, it's Saguna Brahman, that is to say, the transcendent reality manifest with attributes. It would seem to me, very speculatively, that Ramanuja might find a path towards a divinely grounded eco-theology. I don't see how one could draw one from Shankara. This Lance Nelson says, let's ground our eco-theology and eco-ethic in the Dharma. After all, that is the principle by which Vishnu, the god, avatar, Vishnu, the god, orders the world. So Dharma might provide the foundation for a constructive Hindu ecological public theology. Might you construct an eco-theology or an eco-ethic if you are a devotee of the Baha'i religion? Here's a picture of the Baha'i Temple near Northwestern University, just outside of Chicago. One fundamental element of Baha'i belief is that science and religion are two complementary knowledge systems. Climate change is an important symptom of the ecological imbalances created by an economy founded on the temporary cheap energy subsidy provided by fossil fuels, containing ancient solar energy stored in earlier geological epochs but now being exhausted. It's those dead dinosaurs that are making all that oil. And that oil is being exhausted in a matter of decades while threatening the well-being of future generations. It is unjust. Note ecology and justice together. It is unjust that a wealthy minority should privilege itself while imposing the risks and costs of climate change on the poor and on future generations. I would think that Buddhists would find it difficult to ground an eco-theology in divinity. It would be difficult in a manner similar to that of Shankara because ultimate reality finally is impersonal and beyond traits, beyond structure, beyond attributes. The Dalai Lama, one of the world's truly great spiritual leaders, thinks quite to the contrary of what I have just said. Being attentive to the nature of interdependence. Now, that principle of interdependence, pratitya samutpada, or created co-arising, that refers to the world, the causal nexus in which you and I live. So that is where he is grounding what he's going to say about an eco-ethic, being attentive to the nature of interdependence of all creatures, both animate and inanimate. One should never slacken in one's efforts to preserve and conserve nature's energy. Laudato Si. What an achievement. A fine theological and ethical, as well as scientific treatise on Earth as Our Common Home, offered by Pope Francis in 2015. Paragraph 13. The urgent challenge to protect our common home includes a concern to bring the whole human family together to seek a sustainable and integral development. For we know that things can change. Humanity still has the ability to work together in building our common home. We know what the possible and probable futures are. It's time to make the decision to actualize the preferred future. On the one hand, Pope Francis wants to link arms between church and laboratory in furnishing our common home. On the other hand, when it comes to worldview, when it comes to understanding God's will for the planet, we need distinctively theological resources. We can't ask the scientists to do our theology without a license for us. It cannot be maintained that empirical science provides a complete explanation of life, the interplay of all creatures and the whole of reality. This would be to breach the limits imposed by its own methodology. The methodology of the scientist is to look for natural causes for all natural phenomena. Pope Francis believes in God, angels, miracles. That's not part of the scientist's worldview, but it certainly is part of the church's worldview. One of the most energetic and creative ambassadors for eco-theology is Mary Evelyn Tucker at Yale, helped out by her husband, John Grimm. Here she is responding to Pope Francis. The Pope encourages us to see the human economy as a subsystem of nature's economy, namely the dynamic interaction of life in ecosystems. Without a healthy natural ecology, there is not a sustainable economy, and vice versa. How might a Muslim take up the challenge of an eco-theology or an eco-ethic? First, we must consult the Quran. Will the Quran then provide the grounding we're looking for an eco-theology? The Quran provides a unique resource for building an ecological paradigm. The Quran enjoins humanity to walk not exultantly upon the earth, and to view the whole of nature as signs of God. And whatsoever God created for you on the earth of diverse colors, truly, and this is a sign for a people who reflect. Suppose you are a disciple of Confucius living in China today. Have you heard of Loho, the life of harmony? The core ideas of Loho include difference, complementation, mutualistic symbiosis, embodied as respect, communication, and inclusiveness. Loho is usually experimented with in small villages. Loho inhabitation involves ecological dwellings, garbage sorting, water resource protection, and diversity of renewable energy resources. As I mentioned earlier, I like to build on the World Council of Churches motto, the vision of a future just, sustainable, participatory, and planetary society. Carl Sagan, Cornell physicist and no friend of religion, still inspires us. When we think about looking at Earth from afar, it looks like a tiny little blue dot against a black horizon. It's our dot, says Sagan. Look again at that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. Every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived here on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. Here in the early decades of the 21st century, it appears that our beloved planet Earth is riding on the backs of the four horses of the apocalypse. What lies ahead is eco-disaster. Here in this little ride that you and I have been sharing, our destination has been the construction of an ecological public theology. Over the years, I've made an attempt to offer a contribution to such a constructive theology. I call it proleptic theology. It's my attempt to dovetail two things: the understanding of the future as futurum that we see in scientific or secular futurology or futurism. That's the future that is built upon trends in the past and the present that you and I construct through moral decision making. And Adventus, which comes from the theologian, from the divine promise of a new creation or the kingdom of God coming in the future. How do we put those two together? My proleptic principles or middle axioms try to connect our vision of the eschatological kingdom of God with the healthy moral prophecies of our secular futurists. I call these proleptic principles. I've got 7 of them here. The task of the ecological public theologian is to project a vision of a preferred future, to promote a sense of global community, to provide for posterity, to protect human dignity, to proffer the distinction between needs and wants, to propose alliances amongst the various religious groups as well as religious groups with government, economics, and business. Finally, to profess faith. We need to have confidence that the future finally is going to be in God's hands, even though you and I shoulder a great deal of moral responsibility for what happens tomorrow. How do we move from the Bible's eschatological vision of the coming new creation toward the concrete situation within which we find ourselves facing a possible apocalypse? I suggest we develop proleptic principles or middle axioms. When futurology was born in the 1950s, the central tenet was to lift up a vision of a positive future around which people can rally, find inspiration and guidance. God's promise of a new creation, I think, provides the grounding or foundation for such a vision for the theologian today to project a vision of a coming new world order that is A, organized as a single worldwide planetary society, B, united in devotion to the will of God, C, sustainable within the biological carrying capacity of the planet and harmonized with the principles of the ecosphere, D, organized politically so as to preserve the just rights and voluntary contributions of all individuals. That's the participatory component in the World Council of Churches banner. E, organized economically so as to guarantee the basic survival needs of each person. Everyone has the right to survive before some people have the right to affluence. F, organized socially so that dignity and freedom are respected in every quarter. I think dignity is the most precious discovery of the modern world. Can't give that one up as we integrate all things into a holistic vision. G, dedicated to advancing the quality life in behalf of future generations. We have a moral responsibility to our grandchildren, great grandchildren, and to their progeny. Each of our 7 proleptic principles begins with the letters pro, the Greek prefix, which refers us to the future. A prolepsis is a present instantiation of a future reality. So when I wrote this book, God, the World's Future, which is my attempt to offer a constructive systematic theology that prescinds from God's eschatological promise of a new creation, I try to reinterpret all the doctrines proleptically: God, creation, the human condition, the person and work of Christ, the Holy Spirit, church, and of course an integrated proleptic ethics. Writing the first edition in 1992, the third in 2015, it integrates an ecological public theology into an eschatologically oriented systematic theology. The second of the 7 proleptic principles is to promote a sense of global community. The coming apocalypse, the possible apocalypse, will affect everyone on this planet. Oh yes, national identity, ethnic identity, social location, all these things are important to our self-understanding. But unless we have a just, sustainable, and participatory planetary society, our local identities are not going to mean much at all. We must think globally and act locally, says the World Future Society. The third of our proleptic principles is to provide for posterity. That is to say, intergenerational ethics is integral to proleptic ethics. The present generation has a responsibility to the future generations. We want those great, 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 great grandchildren of ours to look back and say, boy, am I glad that generation in the early 21st century looked out for our well-being. As I said a moment ago, the most precious idea, I think, developed in the modern world over the last 3 centuries is the doctrine of human dignity. Philosopher Immanuel Kant puts it best in my judgment. We should treat each person as an end and not merely as a means. Each person has dignity and is a moral end and not merely a means to some further end. I don't believe we can surrender that as we try to integrate all things into a single holistic vision. When the World Council of Churches lifts up a vision of a just, sustainable, and participatory society, it's people with dignity, persons with dignity, that we want integrated into that planetary society. Our fifth proleptic principle is to proffer the distinction between needs and wants, or the difference between needs and greeds. Shouldn't it be the case that everyone should have the right to have their basic needs met? Those in poverty to have shelter, food, and health care before, morally prior to, the opportunity for some of us to garner as much wealth as we possibly can. The sixth of our proleptic principles is to propose alliances. About the year 1960, Pope John the 23rd said that Roman Catholics should ally themselves with all people of goodwill to make this world a better place. Even though I offer a distinctively Christian ecological public theology, the Christians have to share a spirit with leaders in other religious traditions, with governments and businesses and scientific laboratories and educational institutions and the homeless. We need to have a shared vision and a shared spirit of what it will take so that the four horses veer into a different direction and avoid the apocalypse. Finally, proleptic principle number 7, profess faith. Recall that the central tenet of futurology is to lift up a positive vision around which people can rally. Negative judgments about the apocalypse do not inspire, they rather elicit despair. Is there a reason, based upon God's promise of a new creation, that we can sustain hope? Yes, I do believe there is. I hope you like this painting as much as I do. It connotes that sense that our planet is a gift from God, sweet right down to its essence. Many think of John 3:16 as the gospel in miniature, for God so loved the world. In the Greek, that word for world, cosmos. Is it a good idea to think cosmically in all that we are saying? Up until this point, I've been Earth centered. I see it as an advantage to get beyond nationalism and ethnic identity and all the other local identities in order to get to a planetary identity. I support the World Council of Churches' vision of a future just, sustainable, participatory, and of course, planetary society. But our planet is by no means autonomous or isolated. It too is connected with what is beyond. The sun delivers energy 24/7, which made it possible for life to evolve on this planet and continues to make it possible for life on Earth to have a future. We are connected to the sun, which in turn is one star among the 400 billion stars of the Milky Way. The Milky Way is one of what? A trillion, 2 trillion galaxies in this universe. I think it's at least reasonable to think interactively or connectedly or relationally between the sun and our solar system on the one hand and the other stars in the Milky Way on the other. And when we think of the common good, I really like the Roman Catholic notion of the common good. We certainly want to think of it in terms of our whole planet, but could we think of it also in terms of our whole solar system and our whole galaxy? Well, that's the way I like to do it. My good friend Bob Russell, however, is very critical. He argues that because of the light year problem, that the speed of light is finite, he cannot imagine that we can have interactive communication with life on exoplanets elsewhere in the Milky Way. Nevertheless, as an ideal, as we think about God's new creation, I can't believe that the eschatological new creation will be for planet Earth only. Could we think of the common good as belonging to the galaxy or even more? Well, our shared ride toward a constructive ecological public theology has come to an end. We started with the four horses of the apocalypse in the book of Revelation, anticipating eco disaster. And we saw how the scientific community about 1967 became aware of the wrath that is to come and began, like the prophets of ancient Israel, to warn the peoples of our world that we need to adumbrate the possible and probable futures and then make commitments, moral commitments for the preferred future. Religious leaders and theologians had to key from the scientific and economic and social and governmental futurists in the late 1960s and all the way through the 1970s. In more recent decades, quite a variety of eco-theologies and eco-ethical visions have developed. We now see leadership amongst Hindu theologians and Buddhist thinkers, the Baha'i, Islam, Judaism, and a number of Christian thinkers that include liberation theologians and feminist theologians. It's been quite a ride, but the longest and most difficult journey is the one to come.